Welcome to the wide world of trees, your online resource for being a better informed, more responsible tree owner, tree care professional, or tree activist. I'm your host, Gene Basler. Thank you for tuning in. Today I want to talk about tree pruning. And I'm on a residential site where some tree pruning was done. And we're just going to be brutally honest in the places where it wasn't so good. And we're going to point out the places where things were done okay. So, thank you for tuning in. Pruning is probably the basic practice. So let's go over the work here, and then we'll talk about it in a little bit greater depth. The crews were brought on this site after years of what I call goat pruning, commonly called lion's tail pruning, where the entire interior is stripped out. This is a live oak. We are in Houston, Texas. And if you want a good example of why they use the term lion's tail, a lion's tail is naked except for the little tuft at the end. And you look at this leader going off to the right, and we start to see, even after it branches off, once here, and again several times here, the only foliage on this branch resides out at the very ends. You'll find this term in the ANSI A300 pruning standard. Let me get that out here right now since I mentioned it. I strongly advise that you get a copy, even if you're just a tree owner. This is it. American National Standards Institute. It's called the ANSI A300 Part 1. It covers pruning. It has a glossary of terms, and it has some recommendations for specifying tree work. The most important thing in the American National and the ANSI A300 standard, the most important thing I would say is that the pruning objectives should be clearly defined. And it goes on from there. The sister publication from the International Society of Arboriculture is this Best Management Practices Tree Pruning. In fact, it says right here, companion publication to ANSI A300 Part 1, Tree, Shrub, and Other Woody Plant Maintenance, Standard Practices, Pruning. Best Management Practices and ANSI A300 Part 1. So the term lion's tail is mentioned in that standard, or lion's tail pruning, also called lion tailing. The practice is to, and I think it's based on lack of training and lack of skill. When a climber of beginner to intermediate skill level places himself or herself up in a tree, the habit is to, or the inclination and or habit, to begin to take out all these little branches, like these little guys that are stemming from this old cut here. Or, in the case of this tree here, to remove all these sprouts. Let me focus on them a little bit at a time. These are called epicormic sprouts, also called suckers. They're vertical. The tree does this as a kind of an emergency response to having had its interior stripped out. The other very important thing in the ANSI standard is to specify that a certain percentage of the foliage of a tree needs to reside in the lower portion of the crown. And that is to try to steer people away from this practice of stripping out the interior. Now, there's a lot of reasons why a tree needs interior foliage. One reason a tree needs interior foliage is so that the weight and wind sail that the canopy and leaf population represent be more evenly distributed along the length of a leader. So for example, I turn your attention back to this branch. If all of its foliage, all of its weight, and all of its wind sail is out at the end, then that branch or leader or stem will respond more dramatically to the high winds in a storm, and that will actually increase the likelihood of failure or storm damage. If you think of those old sailing ships, I guess when it really comes on to blow, so to speak, I'm trying to hide from the afternoon sun. When it really comes on to blow, I think it would make sense to me, I'm not a sailor, but it would make sense to me that they fold up the one on the top first. Because if they keep that open, then the spar would, or the mast or whatever, would be more likely to snap. So if you're going to conduct weight reduction pruning, do it at the ends. Make pruning selections that are in the 1 to 2, possibly 3 inch diameter size range, that are out at the ends. And the real skill in climbing a tree and negotiating a tree is in tiptoeing past that interior foliage and leaving it intact, and making weight reduction selections from the branch ends. And the other benefit of this is that the tree doesn't look so obviously pruned. In fact, one of the highest compliments a customer can pay a tree guy is, "I got the bill and I can't tell you did any work." So here, maybe I can focus in on this. Cuts like this that are out at the ends are more appropriate. And this is why I instructed my crews to leave these sprouts intact. Yes, they're ugly, and no, they don't necessarily fit into my longer term plan of restoring the interior foliage to the crown of this tree, but I want to leave them intact until I can choose something that I can work with. So crown restoration pruning is another beast altogether that we can talk about if there's an interest from the audience. So this tree has clearly been stripped out more than the other one, and this tree suckered out less. Now I want to bring your attention to this other live oak here that actually belongs to the neighbor, and this is another example of a completely cleaned out interior. And a lot of tree guys have a little cottage industry, so to speak, where they say, "Ma'am, it's been a couple years, time to go get rid of them suckers what's stealing energy from the top of the tree." Now let's talk about that a little bit. I briefly touched upon the structural reasons why we want to have foliage on the interior, in order the better to distribute the weight and wind sail along the length of the stem rather than have it all concentrated at the ends. There's another structural reason, is that branches promote branch taper, and over time we have less weight out at the ends. And I've also heard tell from different arborists and plant scientists that interior foliage has a tendency to take over the photosynthesis process like a minor league team. When the major league photosynthesizers out at the exterior of the crown have been working since early spring, you know, my understanding, or what I've heard, is that their stomates close in an effort to conserve moisture, and that the shaded interior foliage takes over photosynthesis to help get the tree through the most stressful, hot period of the growing season. Now, I haven't read any studies that support that, and I don't know how correct that is. I know it sounds good, and I know that interior foliage is important for a tree, otherwise it wouldn't be there. I also know that some trees like live oak tend, over time, mature trees in their native setting, especially if you look at places like Central Texas and Virginia and Louisiana come to mind to me, places where I've seen live oaks that, you know, there's really little other than old broken off dead stubs in the interior of a tree with live oak. So there's some trees that, you know, over time and in maturity in their native setting, I've seen some that have almost no interior foliage. So I guess perhaps they don't need it anymore. I don't know. Let me just point you to these trees here that also belong to the neighbor. They've been stripped out quite handily too. This is a very common practice here in the Houston area. We're going to walk past this Bradford pear and take a look at this American elm. I did instruct the guys to remove some of the sprouts from the lower portion here. They were hanging low over the alley. But I also want to show this beautiful eastern red cedar. 3 of them here. Nice formidable specimens here. Not too common a sight here in Houston. Interior foliage intact. Lower foliage intact. Lower branches not removed. These are all things that we're looking for. If you're going to remove live foliage from a tree, my position is that you had better have a darn good reason to do so. And roof clearance, of course, is a very good reason. You see here, we've pruned to clear this live oak off of the roof of this garage. We also pruned to provide a little roof clearance along the roof line here too of the house. But we kind of did the minimum necessary to get the clearance over the alley. Now, some of these ugly stubs here are not my guys' work, because there are, if you'll note in the film here, there are some power lines, and a lot of these knuckles are from the line clearance pruning. But what I really want to point out here is that interior foliage has been made to remain intact, and that's the primary objective. Now there are a couple of ugly things, a couple of dog ears and a couple of stub cuts that I would like to see corrected. But again, in the pruner's defense, there was little to work with. So let me bring your attention to this ugly stub here, right here, done with a pole clip, and this dog ear cut. Oh wait, no, that's a leaf. Basically that little ugly stub there, because that cut there is pretty decent. But if we look at this branch, we were trying to get clearance to the neighbor's roof, and since previous stripping efforts left no foliage on the along the length of this branch, we were very limited in our choices. But there are a couple of ugly stubs. Here's another one. See that? But for the most part, I think the guys did a pretty good job with what they were left with. And again, leaving foliage in the tree is better than taking it out. Removing foliage should only be done if you've got a really good reason to do so. Now, my position about removing live foliage from a tree is that roof clearance is a good reason. Street clearance within reason is a good reason, although I think 11 feet is better than 14 feet. Light penetration so grass will grow is a what I would call an illegitimate reason for removing live foliage. It's a lousy excuse. You know, if your turf grass isn't growing well in the shade of a tree, either you don't have enough organic matter in the soil, or the tree just doesn't want it there, so why fight it? Make your bed bigger. This client very wisely and intuitively made his bed into jasmine. I wouldn't say jasmine would be my first choice, but look, and you've got places where grass refuses to grow, then why fight it? Because one thing you can count on is your tree is going to fill back in after you've thinned it out for that precious light penetration, for that precious grass that, in my opinion, does nothing to contribute to your property value, at least not in comparison to your shade trees. It's going to fill back in, so now you've set yourself up to nickel and dime yourself to death. So plant some shade-tolerant grasses and some shade-tolerant woody perennials, and think twice before designing your landscape. Ask yourself, how is this going to affect the tree? So that's pruning in a nutshell. There's a couple of cool publications that I want to call your attention to, that you can find them at www.bartlett.com. Those of you who know, I'm an employee of the Bartlett Tree Expert Company, and I work here in Houston, Texas. Yeah, I love this company, but this website has a really cool thing. If you go to the bottom of the home page and click on, I think it's Site Map, and you go down to Site Map and you look for resources, and there's a library, and there's some cool stuff like this. Pruning ornamental shrubs, maintenance pruning standard, a simplified view. And so they go into defining maintenance. I'm going to look at my notes here for a few minutes because I'm about to wrap up, but I want to make sure I didn't miss any of these points. Because there's a lot of questions you as a homeowner should ask, and you as a tree care professional should ask. The pruning, I guess, what's the definition of pruning? Removing plant tissue from a plant is pruning. I mean, doing it on purpose. So some of the objectives with shrubs, the objective might be to maintain a certain shape or size, or to rejuvenate a struggling plant. Rejuvenation pruning is not something I recommend for trees, by the way. That doesn't work the same way as it does with shrubs. Structural pruning is training young trees to, usually what we're trying to do with structural pruning is promote vertical growth so that it doesn't branch out too early. Let's say you put an elm tree or a live oak tree in the front yard of a two-story house, and these guys, especially a live oak, its growth habit is to be 1.5 to 2 times as wide as it is tall. So it's going to start branching out almost immediately, and it's going to be, up against the house, over the driveway, over the street, encroaching on the neighbor's property in a few short years. That's why I'm super pleased with the cathedral variety of live oak, which has been hybridized in order to maintain kind of a Christmas tree shape and what we call apical dominance, a strong central leader and continued vertical growth, well beyond the typical habit of a live oak. It's only been around for about 20 years, but there's some pretty good examples of it here in town. But the purpose of structural pruning is to attempt to promote vertical growth. That's the usual purpose. There are other purposes, but usually you want to take a young tree and promote vertical growth, and the other reason for structural pruning is to get rid of weak branch unions as early as possible in a tree's life, so that you're not dealing with it later, dealing with a split, a tight V crotch. Like, for example, this one right here. This would have been a nice branch to correct when it was a lot younger. This tight V crotch here on this live oak. These more obtuse branch unions actually tend to be stronger, where you don't have an inclusion and you don't have each year's annual growth ring where the two components push against each other. And with a good obtuse branch union, they tend to be stronger with each new year. So, structural pruning is generally focusing on promoting vertical growth and correcting poor or weak branch unions. Maintenance pruning, of course, is different. You're removing dead branches. I hate the term crown cleaning, but it's accepted as long as you define it properly as properly removing a specified size range of dead branches. Crown thinning, raising for clearance, and the old enemy topping is the old method of bringing the top out of a tree. Crown reduction pruning is the industry accepted alternative to that bad old way of doing things, where we reduce the height of a tree by pruning back to a suitable lateral branch, rather than just leave those big ugly stubs in the tree. A homeowner should be on the same page with his or her tree care professional about clearly defined objectives. And you tree care professionals that are watching, define your objectives. Don't say Class A, Class 1, Class 2 pruning, like the old NAA standards, but clearly define your objectives. You know, thin the crown. Don't say thin the crown. Say thin the crown to reduce the weight, the wind resistance, and the risk of storm damage. Don't say raise the lower limbs. You know, what's your objective? Is your objective in raising the lower limbs to clear the roof, to clear the security light, the street lamp? To clear the street? Or is your objective to get light to penetrate? Not an objective that I agree with, but be clear about your objectives. You're just going to thin the crown. What's that mean? You're going to reduce the crown. What's your objective? It's usually so that the homeowner can sleep better at night. It's an objective. I guess that's it. There's a couple of illegitimate excuses. Like I said, one is so that grass will penetrate. But also, you know, if you've got a tree and you've examined its structure and you're not sure whether or not to keep it, pruning might be an alternative. But at that point, you want to ask yourself, if I got to take more than, say, a quarter of the leaf population of this tree out to reach my comfort level, so where I can live with it and not be so worried about it blowing over in a storm, then maybe you should consider removing the tree. And some questions you should ask as a lay person. You know, tree owners don't really know good tree work from bad, but they know whether or not the cleanup was suitable. Most, you know, Angie's List, Better Business Bureau, you name it, people are always complaining about the cleanup, or they're always saying the cleanup was great. And I'm like, well, the tree work was horrible. So I think it's important for a lay person to be able to distinguish good tree work from bad. And you've already seen, you know, have they completely stripped it out, or have they left some interior foliage intact? Those cedars were good examples of trees that a lot of the foliage was left intact. They were very, very conservative about the amount of live foliage that they removed from those trees. And that's the sort of thing you're looking for. You want to know if there are any stubs or any dog-ear cuts, or a dog-ear cut is cut at a crazy angle. And see if I can find an example. I bet you there's one in this tree. Okay, here's probably a dog-ear cut. Arguably, you could call this a dog-ear cut, where it's cut out at a bit of an angle. So if it was more of a perpendicular cut, it would be a better cut. This one right here is halfway decent, pretty decent cut. And let me see if I can zoom in on another dog ear. I usually send the guys back after their dog ear cuts, and I find that they were done near the end of the day. They're trying to cut the branch with a pole saw rather than climbing out after it. I'm not seeing any, which is good. What about over here? So on this cut right here, rather than lop the branch off, they cut back to a lateral. That's a pretty decent cut. flush cut is another thing you want to look for, where they just try to make it as flush with the parent stem as possible. That's an inappropriate type of cut. Does the climber use tree spikes? Big question. If you're a tree care professional and you're using spikes in a tree that you're not removing, you're wrong. And I bet you know better. If you're a homeowner, it's good to ask right up front. You guys use spikes? Well, no, ma'am, we'll never spike a tree unless we're taking it down. That better be the answer. Tree spikes, studies show that tree spikes put a special type of wound in a tree that renders it especially susceptible to disease. Another common practice is to prune everything that breaks the horizontal plane and points downward, so that the only thing remaining in the tree is horizontal or upwards. That shouldn't be done either. Another thing to ask your tree climber is if is he using a chainsaw for 1-inch diameter wood? Where's your handsaw? You know, handsaws in the tree care industry today, you're cutting, with the possible exception of live oak, which is the densest wood in the North American continent, you're cutting things 4 inches in diameter with a handsaw. And so most pruning is done with a handsaw, or should be done with a handsaw. The habit of using a chainsaw for your trees is, especially for small trees, it's inefficient. It's probably representative of poor training and poor technique. And you want to ask a climber if he's removing every little twig, and that goes back to getting rid of suckers and to stripping out the interior of foliage. That about wraps it up here. I hope you've enjoyed this. I know I haven't covered every aspect of pruning, but I would like to address your questions. Your questions drive the next episode. I got a question about a post oak from one of my online coaching clients in Georgia, and I mean to address that question. And the question was that there's a land reuse or repurposing construction site, and how do we deal with the post oak? I've mentioned in some of my YouTube videos that post oaks are notoriously sensitive trees, and they'll die if you look at them funny. But they're pretty well known to be super sensitive. This particular tree, my advice was to put up your protective fence 100 feet out, put 4 to 6 inches of either coarse wood chips or mulch, coarse wood chips preferably, in the entire root zone of the tree. To use 6-foot chain link fence, the kind you rent that has its own stand so you don't have to drive any stakes, instead of that orange protective fencing that's most commonly used. In this particular case, they wanted to rip out the entire understory of this tree, all of the understory plants, and I advise against that too. Unless it's a safety issue where there's a jogging trail and they don't want somebody to lurk in the understory, then leave the understory plants intact. And if you insist on getting rid of them, then do it at the very, very end of the construction project. It'd also be a good idea to fertilize this post oak and write into the specs that pay an arborist to come by and inspect it once or twice a month, and what you want to do is you want to make sure that nobody's parking a pallet of bricks in the root zone of this tree or within the drip line of this tree, and nobody's breached the fence, and that there's as little disturbance as possible around the root zone of this tree. Thanks for tuning in. Feel free to leave your comments. Signing off.